Professor Rajkumar, Professor Patnaik, Professor Sudarshan, Professor Mohan Kumar, Professor Amreen, distinguished guests, faculties and students of OP Jindal Global University. Arun Jaitley and I were contemporaries. He was a student at Sri Ram College of Commerce. I was a student at Hindu College. Getting into those institutions of learning then was a lot easier than it is today. I have only nice things to say about Arun, but I'm reasonably sure if both he and I were to reapply with the kind of marks that we had when we applied at the university initially, neither of us would stand a chance of entry. But Arun made his mark in life early. He did reasonably well as a student. He did better as a student activist. And he believed what I think is something that all you youngsters should at least look into. And I'm quoting a German philosopher who said, "Genius lies in identifying yourself with a principle." And those were the times we lived in. Arun became president of the Delhi University Students' Union, I think around June of 1975. I have the date somewhere, 74. Well, then came the emergency. The Students' Union was disbanded and Arun was imprisoned for 18 months, if I remember correctly. So, as a young activist, he identified himself with democracy and freedom. And what is more important, he identified himself with all that is important in terms of coordinates, in terms of the kind of India we are trying to build, anchored in the rule of law. He was a student, he was a Democrat, he was a lawyer, and he was a politician. There is much in him that I admired. In many ways, he was an inspiration to many in my generation. There were points on which we happily and democratically disagreed. And we did so given the freedoms that we had. I was already a civil servant when the emergency was imposed. But like many others, I stuck my neck out. And when the elections were called, and I remember as a young officer, trainee officer in Tokyo, when we went to the Kyodo building. Kyodo is the Japanese news agency. That was much before iPhones. We were in the age of teleprinters. And twice the bell on the teleprinter rang. Mrs. Gandhi had lost her election and Sanjay Gandhi had lost his election. So when we celebrate Arun Jaitley, we also celebrate the extraordinary achievements, I should say, which he registered in a setting which was not of his choosing. In 1974 or 75, I was asking my young colleague, what was the size of the Indian economy? He told me it should be $100 billion. By the time he became a minister, and he had the privilege of holding two of the most important jobs in any cabinet system, and certainly in ours, he was Minister for Finance and Defense. India was then a $2 trillion economy. Arun's contribution to the one country, one tax, or what you call the GST, is there for everyone to see. So I'm sometimes puzzled when my friends across the political divide seek to find fault in the GST as it rolled out then. I equally find fault when some of those young guys go around waving a copy of the Constitution in cellophane cover outside the parliament Because if they'd opened the cellophane cover and read the preface to that edition of the Constitution, the preface itself is a severe indictment of what happened in 1975. That the then government decided to do for the first time in the annals of Indian history, and I think it will also be the last time, that civil liberties were curtailed, the Constitution was overthrown, and an emergency was imposed. And that they chose to wave those copies of the Constitution in cellophane cover around when it was the 50th anniversary of the emergency makes me wonder who does the thinking on their behalf. So, and if any of you youngsters, I know many of you, you come from the best possible educational backgrounds, getting into OP Jindal now is even tougher than it was getting into our elite colleges. And certainly, it's as difficult getting into OP Jindal as it is into getting into Hindu college. By the way, lest there be any misunderstanding, the Hindu college is ranked the number 1 today in the country. Mohan, don't you ever forget that. Although I went across the road and taught at St. Stephen's College. They were generous with me. They allowed me to come across the road and spend a year there. And in
you named the college because they called that college as the college.
They used to call it the college. And they used to call us across the road. And I was presenting the Hindu Business Online Awards the other day in Mumbai. And one of the awardees said that he was grateful that one of his students was also amongst the awardees. I was almost tempted into getting into a student-teacher thing. I think it may be dangerous in this setting because some of these guys sitting here, I know what it is, how boring it is to be asked to attend a lecture after class. So one of my young friends who's sitting here, I'm not identifying her because she might get upset with me. Her mother called me and said, she will be there in your lecture. And I turned around and said, I hope she's not missing class. She said, no, I'm not missing class. I genuinely want to hear you. So, look, I don't know if you're here genuinely interested, but I'm going to say a few things to provoke you. Okay? First and foremost, I think, as I said, I've been fascinated by forces making for continuity and change all my life. I think that continuity and change should be studied in universities in a more systematic manner. And I am mentioning this only to recall where we were in 2014 when Mr. Modi assumed the mantleship of governance. And I was invited to deliver a lecture on India and the Western liberal democratic order, for which I prepared, and the lecture was delivered at the Nehru Memorial Library. I have a copy of it with me, and if you permit, I want to read out just a page or so out of that. I will skip a few parts, but I just want to read out the operative parts. For most of my adult life, I have been fascinated by issues related to continuity and change. Except for historical events that are truly revolutionary in character and result in sudden cataclysmic change, students of the social science like me, for most of the time try to study the phenomena of continuity and change as part of inexorable forces that, at the very least, that are at the very core, are anchored in a struggle between a reassuring status quo and forces making the change based on an increase and explosion of knowledge, innovation and technology, to name a few. One generation, to just cite one example, concluded its study of physics by saying that the atom is indivisible. A succeeding generation was able to commence its knowledge of physics by empirically demonstrating that the atom is divisible, and that too with devastating consequence. Now, in the year 1700, a good 57 years before the colonial power decided to set sail and establish a company here, a commercial economic trading company, India's GDP, according to a Cambridge historian, Angus Maddison, was something in the vicinity of 25% of global GDP in the year 1700. In fact, China and India together around 1700 and 1750 contributed to 50% of the global GDP. And then we came across 190 years of colonial experience, starting with the Battle of Plassey in 1757. And our contribution to global GDP came down to, I think, 3% or less, 2%, I'm told. Now, I can understand, and most of you have probably more knowledge on what makes colonial economics do what it does, how it arrests development, how the period between 1750 and 1850, which is the period of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, how that period resulted in industrialization there and deindustrialization here. But there's something a little more. I don't mind the GDP coming down, but they also succeeded in something far more serious, and that is they also succeeded in instilling an inferiority complex in their colonies. And I want to just quote from a few people who will just, those quotes will capture what I'm thinking. Samuel Langhorne Clemens was born on 30th November 1835 in Florida, Missouri, better known as Mark Twain. He traveled at the age of 60 to India and to what was then known as Ceylon, or Sri Lanka now. Some excerpts from his diary. In religion, all other countries are paupers. India is the only millionaire. India is the cradle of the human race, the birthplace of human speech, the mother of history, the grandmother of legend, and the great-grandmother of tradition. Our most valuable and most instructive materials in the history of man are treasured up in India only. So far as I am able to judge, nothing has been left undone, either by man or nature, to make India the most extraordinary country that the sun visits on his rounds. Nothing seems to have forgotten, nothing overlooked. Just in case you think this is a, overly sentimental American who found fascination for India at the age of 60, and you begin to think that, then I'll give you one or two more. This is what the French scholar Romain Rolland had to say. If there is one place on the face of earth where all dreams of living men have found a home, from the very earliest days when man began the dream of existence, it is India. And Albert Einstein, we owe a lot to the Indians who taught us how to count, without which no worthwhile scientific discovery would have been made. And Swami Vivekananda, India for thousands of years peacefully existed. Here activity prevailed when even Greece did not exist. Even earlier, when history had no record and tradition dares not peer into the gloom of that intense past. Even from then until now, ideas after ideas have marched out from her, but every word has been spoken with a blessing behind it and peace before it. We of all nations of the world have never been a conquering race, and that blessing is in our head, and therefore we live. I put this in terms of the tributes, and then I come to one policy maker. All 36 paragraphs of Thomas Babington Macaulay's Minute on Education, 2 February 1835, merit being read in their entirety. I will quote only a few lines to provide an insight into the motivation and context that this monumental change of narrative and mindset entailed. Stuff comes before this, I admit, and says, we have to educate a people who cannot at present be educated by means of their mother tongue. He's referring to Indians. I am quite ready to take the Oriental learning at the valuation of the Orientalists themselves. I have never found one among them who can deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. The intrinsic superiority of the Western literature is indeed fully admitted by those members of the committee who support the Oriental plan of education. I don't know who he collected in that committee, but I just want to fast forward very quickly and give you some statistics. India has gone from contributing 25% of the global GDP down to 2%. When Mr. Modi came, it was a $2 trillion economy. Today, it is a $4.3 trillion economy. We overtook the United Kingdom, which produced Mr. Thomas Babington Macaulay to become the 5th largest economy. We overtook Germany to become the 4th largest economy. And even though some people think that we are a dead economy, and that view was endorsed by a young leader who has been straining at youth politics for a while, we grew last quarter at 7.8% and the quarter before that at 7.4%. We will overtake Germany at this rate within a few months, not a few years, to become the world's 3rd largest economy. Now, when we talk of India 2047 and Viksit Bharat, this is where I want to digress from my notes, which I shall make available to any of you who are interested, and we can get them recorded somewhere. I want to go that we, no matter what we become, a $7-10 trillion economy, a Viksit Bharat, which means a developed economy. Neither Mohan nor me, when during our days with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade or the World Trade Organization, nobody's ever defined what a developed country is. I know what the definition of a developing country is, also with some difficulty, because some amongst the developing countries are called least developed, and their listing, about 37 or so they were earlier, they are least developed by agreement so accepted, and if they do good work and they graduate, then they move from the least developed category to a developed category. Now, certainly per capita income cannot be an indication. Size of GDP cannot be an indication, because for every country which has a very high per capita, I can name a few small city-states. Singapore has a very high per capita, chooses to call itself a developing country. Some of the countries in the Middle East still decide to call themselves developing countries. And China, which has a GDP of what, $20 trillion now, it also decides to call itself a developing country. So I move from there and say, what would it take in terms of indices, in terms of indicators of life, ease of living, health, education. And let me come now today to these two, but I want to talk for a few minutes on education. You know, I had the privilege of being Minister for Housing and Urban Affairs for 7 years, from 3rd September 2017 to, I think, June of 2024. Those 7 years saw the transformation of the urban sector, and I'll just give you a few figures. In the 10 years prior to 2014, I'm told that the total cumulative spend on the urban sector was 17,000 crores. No, that became the next 10 lakh. 1,57,000 crores is what became next year. But if you go in the previous 10 year, now 1,57,000 crores will be what? $20 billion or what? No, I don't know. 20 if you have an 80 exchange rate. So your spend on the urban sector just became 10 times. No, it's been 12 or 13 times. That's the figure. As I said, I'm not referring to my notes. It's better this way. No matter which way you looked at it, Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, that is affordable housing, 4 crores with a promise of another 3 crore. But I skip all that. 270 million people were lifted during these 10 years or 11 years out of what is called multidimensional poverty. When I was a negotiator in the UN in New York, that was the phase when this SDGs or the Millennium Development Goals, the first phase, MDGs, that phase was coming to an end. The MDGs were a set of prescriptions. Somebody sitting in the think tank of the West, that is the OECD, said you should do this, you should do this, you should. And dutifully, we accepted that. And the well-known statement or feeling around New York was, had it not been for China, which succeeded in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty with little help from India, Nigeria, and other countries, well, MDGs, I don't know what the result would have been, but the MDGs succeeded because China succeeded. When I became a negotiator there and we were reviewing the end phase of the MDGs and the beginning phase of the SDGs, we said that this has to be done differently. instead of somebody sitting in a think tank, and I was then, by the way, later I did join a think tank, but I avoided that temptation. We decided that it has to come from the bottom up, that is from the grassroots level up. So a number of SDGs were defined, 16 or 17, several goals were defined, and it became apparent that if the SDGs were to succeed, India had to succeed. And that, I think, is where the Modi story comes in. Those 11 years come in. I have my speech, I'll circulate it around. All the figures are there. What does it mean? It means SDG 5, gender. I'm just picking one up because out of memory. What the Modi years have shown is that we have gone first into women-centered development, and then we've transformed into women-led development. Let me explain. When we built toilets, first time that the Prime Minister announced it from the ramparts of the Red Fort, all my liberal, slight left of center, those who were not even woke, said, is this something that you talk about from the ramparts of the Red Fort, building toilets? So what the hell else would you like him to talk about? Waging war somewhere? I mean, but this is the fundamental. And if you look at the Swachhta or the sanitation campaign, it's central to all the urban schemes and to the rural schemes. So if you build 11 crore toilets, public toilets, or you build individual household toilets, what are you doing? You're giving dignity to the girl child. Otherwise, our daughters, sisters had to go out into the fields to answer the call of nature. But you went further than that. When you did the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana or affordable housing scheme, you decided that the title of the house would be in the name of the lady of the house. Why? Because invariably, in the event of domestic discord, our society's experience, and I suspect every society, Professor Legge, it's a woman of the house who gets shortchanged. So, once the title of the house is in the name of the lady of the house, it gives some guarantee. It's not a total guarantee, but it helps. So, I can go on giving things that we did in women-centered development. If you're buying a property and it's going to be registered, I always tell Lakshmi that she should register anything we buy in her name because you get 2% stamp duty advantage. But these are little things which you can cumulatively say. And then came the biggest reform of them all, that as soon as we get the census done and as soon as we get the delimitation of constituencies, there will be 33.3% of seats reserved in the legislative assemblies and in the central parliament. Believe me, some of the most advanced countries in the world, the most developed countries, that's why I came to the definition of development, don't have that. Even what do you call it? Universal adult franchise. We talk big, but many countries brought it in later. And they brought it in when, you could no longer ignore it. Coming to education, look, where I was Housing and Urban Affairs Minister, I said to myself all the time that if you're taking a decision which is going to affect the urban sector, and you have to look at connectivity, you have to look at a number of things, you have to look at demographic factors, how populations in a democracy, they have the freedom and they will move from rural to the urban, from tier 3 cities and tier 2 cities to mega cities. Look, the fact of the matter is that when we became an independent country in 1947, the total urban population in India was 17%, which makes it about 17% of 300 million or 350 million, which was the population. The population of Delhi then was 8 lakhs, lakhs being 800,000. When people from my part of the world, my ancestors came in from West Pakistan as refugees, it went up from 8 lakhs to 22 lakhs. I don't know what the census in Delhi will produce, but most of you have a Delhi Connect. I don't think it's going to be less than 2 crores plus. So the urban space matters. But what matters even more than the urban rejuvenation, I think, is education. So I used to say, when it comes to urban decision making, guys, location, location, location. And then when it comes to development and developing a country, and you're talking about 2047, India is a developed country, what is apparent is that education, education, education. Therefore, I'm always very happy to be interacting with a group like this. I know some of my more famous friends in the world, and I have a lot of friends. I spent 39 years outside in the Foreign Service, 4 years in think tanks. Some of them said, you know, don't bother to go to a university, just hang around with young people. Or next best, sit on these side cafes in Paris, meet some intelligent people, have a drink, you get ideas. And that's the world of ideas. But no, I think universities, and that's what the founding Vice Chancellor was referring to, today schools of learning are also becoming centers of innovation, that you are not only getting the best brains, you are incubating those, and you are also then developing an output which in turn gets plowed back into society. So education is important, and that I think is something we all realize the value, but skilling is equally important. But the kind of education that we are getting now, and with the advent of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and a host of other things, you have a problem. So what do you do? So when Lakshmi and I speak every morning, we said, well, who's doing this research? Oh, 1 minute, sometimes I get such brilliant research that I also have to worry. Has it come out of Chat GPT or whatever it's called, or AI, whatever? No, wherever it's come from, you must learn how to. So you need people handling that, managers of that. And as my boss keeps telling me, do whatever else, be careful. You start applying it to court cases, you suddenly find the wrong arguments ending up with... No, look, there are limits to all this. And those limits are defined by the levels of excellence in terms of intellectual rigor that you produce in universities and schools like this. That, I think, is the challenge, and that is, I think, where they're going. But coming back, I'm coming back to something that Mohan and I discussed. If India is to be a $7-10 trillion economy, or a 20, 25, 30 trillion economy, as Ernst & Young and all those guys are saying, you're not going to do it in isolation. You're going to do it in a world. What will be the shape of the world? Today, if I'm not mistaken, 50% of our GDP comes from the external sector. The value of goods and services exported, imported, the value of remittances. But what is the multilateral system in which we were born and which we are in, and where exactly are we going? I want to just spend a minute or two reflecting on the origins of that, and to ask ourselves a question. Because I had the privilege sometimes before I came back from New York, of being the Secretary General of an independent commission which was set up around the UN system by the International Peace Institute to look at the functioning of the UN. I think it was 70th anniversary then. It was called the Independent Commission on Multilateralism. It was chaired by a very illustrious and very great fun guy, Kevin Rudd, who was Prime Minister of Australia, and I was the Secretary General. I want to look at, it looked at 16 thematic areas. I want to look at those sometimes, and from what happens, and because even my second book, Delusional Politics, raised those issues. This lecture I didn't quote fully, raised the issues which the first Trump presidency were throwing up. But let me just go back to the origins of this quickly. No, it's entirely possible. It's in another folder, but I remember the dates roughly. When we talk of the multilateral system, what is it that we are speaking of? We are speaking essentially of the Bretton Woods Conference and the Havana Charter. By the Bretton Woods Conference, I mean a sleepy village in New Hampshire. Please correct me if I'm getting, and I think the dates were around 1946, 7, there all the brainy guys around the world collected. I forget the names of the guys, the White. John Maynard Keynes I remembered, but the other guy was White, right? The American Secretary of Finance or the Treasury. I'll look it up and correct it in the record in any case. So they collected and they came out for the blueprint for the establishment or what then came to be known IBRD, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. That was, I think, there was not too much because The UN itself was being discussed in terms of its contours at the San Francisco conference. The San Francisco conference took place when the Second World War was still going on. And you were looking at the beginnings of a post-war architecture. By the post-war architecture means everybody was sure that the UN was going to be, that there will be an end to the war, a UN will be born, which leads me to another point which will come back. They said that you can only reform the multilateral system if there is war. Otherwise, it doesn't get reformed because those who have a dominant position and a vested interest, they will not allow change to take place. But it's a cynical view. I don't think we should subscribe to that. San Francisco conference gave the blueprint of the UN. You had to decide where to anchor the UN. And I came across a beautiful book, which means there's a gentleman called Rothschild. He made a lot of money. He went to the people who had to take the decision and said, you can't locate it in San Francisco. Why? Because it will be too close to the enemy. But Japan was then the enemy. So, it's, West Coast would be too close. You can't have the UN located in Washington, D.C. Why? Because, just imagine, you've already got 100 ambassadors, wasting your time and coming and harassing you. Just imagine you've got another 100 UN ambassadors. I don't know what the number of states was. They'll also come and harass you. So, but nobody realized that he had meanwhile bought off all the, the swampland in New York, which was going at a throwaway price. He had bought it all off. And he told the UN, you have the UN in New York, and I will make you a building and the residence of the UN Secretary General free. And the decision makers then were more gullible than the decision makers now. I'm not giving any place. I didn't say India or anywhere. I didn't name. So don't later on quote me out of context. So they said agreed. And New York became the headquarters. I like it. I love New York. I was ambassador there. I worked in a think tank there, and it's one of my favorite cities. What was the fundamental defining characteristic of the UN in the multilateral system? It had something called the Security Council. What is the value of the Security Council? The value is that is the only agency in the multilateral system which has the authority designated by the world body to make a determination whether there is a threat to international peace and security. And having made that determination, that's the only body that can then decide to authorize all means necessary within quotes, which is a euphemism for the use of force. I had the privilege of presiding over the UN Security Council in 2011 and 12. And that's when all hell broke loose. The Security Council was given by the permanent members the authority for the use of force. I was representing India, and I kept telling people, hey, you're picking on the wrong guys. Something is going to go wrong. But, the Security Council members were full of bravado. We will do this. One guy told me, and it's all captured in a book I've written called Perilous Interventions. When I wrote it, everybody said, you won't have any friends left in America. I said, why? He said, very critical. But before the book could see the light of day, President Obama had already changed his policy, and the book became an instant bestseller, and now it's prescribed reading in American universities on the use of force. So sometimes other people can help you out. But coming seriously, Libya and resolution, I don't remember correctly, 1973 or something like that, it'll come back to me. And that was the first time the Security Council, after a long time, had the authority to use force, and it was bungled. Then after that, something really went wrong in Syria. And everybody was pleading with the Security Council, please, 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 use force to stop what was going on in Syria. And two of these permanent members, having seen the behavior of the other three earlier, decided no matter what happened, they would not allow the Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force. So the Security Council, ladies and gentlemen, became almost paralyzed, and today it's as good as not being there. What do I mean by that? Today you had wars taking place everywhere. My book, Perilous Interventions, covers the annexation of Crimea. I don't know whether I use the word, but takeover of Crimea. What did the Security Council do? Nobody bothered to go there. Today you've got wars taking place all over the world. I don't mean just action in the Middle East, Gaza, Iran, Hamas. I'm not talking about that. I'm not even talking about Russia, Ukraine. But is the Security Council a point of reference? I don't think so. And I think my colleague Jaishankar's speech. By the way, there was a time when Professor Mohan Kumar and I used to think that the major work of the of the UN is developmental work. There was a time we used to think that the best thing that happened, and I still say that happened to the UN after a long time, was the Sustainable Development Goals, because everybody was around it. The world will look better with sustainability, and sustainability as an ingrained thing. But then the world changed. Along came people who said, we don't need anything green. Do what you can. Dig, baby, dig. What's it called? No, drill, baby, drill. No, I'm thinking of our 1901 Dig Boy. Dig Boy is our first refinery in India. And they named it Dig Boy because the British supervisor couldn't use the speak Assami. So Dig Boy means B-O-Y. When it came to call the Dig Boy refinery. So one is there. Then come to the trading system. Now that's where I think we can have a bit of a discussion. When the Havana conference took place, they came up with the blueprint of what is called an international trade organization, which would be universal, which was the Havana conference, remind me, it was called the Havana Conference of Employment and Trade. So it was a much more this thing. So if you look at the original preamble of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, by the way, don't believe Professor Mohan Kumar that when he was first posted as First Secretary GATT, he didn't know what it stood for. So since I was the First Secretary and I had to make a speech for India, but became the chairman, he read out my speech. And he was a smart guy. He knew what it meant. He was just trying to impress you. So he knew what GATT stood for. GATT is General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It's fascinating because the United States legislature refused to ratify the Havana Charter. They decided to pick up Chapter 4 from the Havana Charter and convert it into what is called the Interim Committee of International Trade Organization to give it a legal cover, ICITO. And that became the GATT. And that's where I went in 1981. Some of the most fascinating postings I've had. That's where my experience on trade disputes comes in. For a very long time, I thought I was the Indian with the maximum number of dispute panels in the GATT and WTO, to my credit. Mohan may have exceeded me, I don't know. Not yet? Good. Keep it that way. Some records I want to keep. I'm just joking. And it came along. But there are people who don't like the multilateral trading system anchored in the GATT. I'm not saying I love it. I have a problem. I have a problem in the sense that for me, the way I'm educated, the way I'm conditioned, I prefer any system based on the rule of law, even if it is flawed, because at least we know then what the rules are. Now, there was a time when developing countries suddenly became very competitive in the area of trade in textiles and clothing, and lo and behold, somebody came around and said, well, trade and textiles and clothing is a special category. Therefore, we will have a special arrangement called the multi-fiber arrangement. And that multi-fiber arrangement turned out to be a derogation from the rules, free trade rules of the GATT. So, I think developing countries were shortchanged. Some people were unhappy, but we decided to lump it and we said we'll change according to the rules. And we did very well. When India started filling its quotas, and the importing countries wouldn't help us out, well, our industrialists were smart guys. They went and set up shop in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and set up an industry there, even though both those countries had no natural or man-made fibers there. They started importing the man-made fiber or natural fiber and built up a very successful industry. The point I'm making is, no matter what trade policy rules you try to work out, it is always better to have a system anchored in some law. Rather than, now why is that better? Because I think the strong or the powerful ones will dominate it, no doubt. But I would rather have a powerful partner dominating a system based on the rule of law than have no rule of law, because that results in anarchy. Where are we today? I frankly don't know. Maybe those of you who study multilateral trade will tell me. But I think at the end of the day, India will do well. Tariffs will hurt us. Possibly, I don't know. But they will also unleash entrepreneurial strength that we have. I remember when we had to face the pandemic in the year 2019 end and 2020, the Prime Minister appointed a group of ministers to oversee the health sector. I was one of 4 ministers, one of 5. And, you know, the previous government had closed the vaccine manufacturing capacity, which was then in the public sector. They decided to close it, and we had to start from scratch. A lot of people thought we'd be doomed. Not only did we manufacture 220 or 240 doses of vaccine, distributed most of them free inside India, but also did something like vaccine friendship and send them to 150 countries outside. So, when people tell me, oh, this will happen, I am a firm believer that if one door closes, very many other doors will be discovered. So I think the world of the health sector is a great one. But in order to keep that going, and this is where I come back to a point in a somewhat belabored manner, you've got to keep your education and skill program going. Because I believe, and I'm not saying something which goes against the law anywhere, once you educate someone, once you give them the ability to undertake cutting-edge research, compete with people in today's day and world, it doesn't matter where you're located. You will imbibe it. I mean, you was telling me, Vice Chancellor, that you're opening a STEM school here. You know, I shouldn't say this in a public forum, but I've been a great supporter of the college I went to. And they have an AI lab, my God. I mean, Subbu, my friend, the CEO of, he said, with a little bit of help from friends. Now, you can do things. I mean, there are pockets of excellence even within older institutions. Sometimes we fear excellence. I mean, that's something, it's a trend we have to also learn to fight. Because what happens if somebody is very bright, then everybody says, is an aberration. No. What you need to do is to raise the template, to raise the bar and have more of those guys rather than, so that they do, have that effect on society. But most important I find, and this is where it's important, you look at our startups, and I think it's something to do with education. I'll come in a few minutes to my sector, the energy sector, to say where education and the use of technology has helped out. Who would have thought, say, 10 years from now, and Rizal, we should put this note, that we would have, God knows what, 100 startups now? Unicorns. Of course, startups, you've had many, but unicorns. And you know what a unicorn is. So if you've got 100 of them, something is happening right. You know, I was associated with the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas 4 years plus ago, in I think June of 2021 or something, July. We have gone in biofuel blending from 1.4% to 20%, and we are raring to go. Today, we could take it up, but we have to take the ecosystem along. We have to take the Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers along. We have to take the others along. So it's not that we can't. We just want to make sure we do it right. We have gone into a variety of feeds. Earlier, people used to make it only from sugar and sugarcane and heavy molasses. Today, you're making it from agricultural waste. Nearby in Panipat, you're making ethanol from bamboo. The Prime Minister just inaugurated a plant in Numaligarh. We are talking about making biocrude from seaweed. We are talking about sweet sorghum as a source. This is all indigenous. Now, did this technology come from outside? I don't think so. There was a time when we went to Praj Industries in Pune. I'm not naming them for commercial reasons, but for the fact it's an entirely homegrown industry. The equipment that they manufacture, and they are exporting that equipment now. I was ambassador in Brazil. That's where I picked up my ideas on ethanol from. But Brazil is very different from India. It has 3 times India's land area, 1/6 our population, and 23% of the world's freshwater reserve. They have no shortage, but I can't afford to base my ethanol on either a food crop to undermine food security or make it so concentrated and dependent on water. But I see Paraj Industry exporting his equipment there to make it do it. Now, I came across an interesting entrepreneur from Ahmedabad. We are very fortunate. We have both cylinder gas, which is made, which is a product of a refinery made from crude oil. And we have 33 crore connections. So if one connection goes to one household with 4 people in it, then we've saturated the whole country, 1.4 billion people. But there are some countries not so fortunate. Even Brazil, 30% of its rural population uses coal and firewood. But an entrepreneur picked up the idea and sold, 10 million cooktops from India, exported them to this country, I think Kenya, and imported 93 octane ethanol from Brazil and running a business. So the households are very happy. You've got clean cooking medium. And by the way, this is another point of transformation. The Modi government provides to beneficiaries of Ujjwala cooking for as little as 6 cents in a day, at a time when we are providing 800 million people, 3 meals of dry ration in a day. That is the transformation in India. But coming back to trade policy and where we are headed, I think that the time has come for people not only to look at how to deal with disruption in supply chains in a more comprehensive manner, because I think things can be done, but also to negotiate trade deals which will stand the scrutiny and the test of the challenges. And I think that effort is on. I'm 100% sure that the outcome would be successful. Therefore, I have very cautiously avoided saying anything which can be interpreted or misinterpreted in terms of what's going on in the current round of trade negotiations. I would say that the challenges for India are going to only increase. It is one thing to be one country which is under colonial domination for 190 years. You reach from 25% contribution to global GDP, you come down to 3%. But now when you go from being the 4th to the 3rd largest economy, and given the changes that are taking place, and these are technology-driven changes driven by education, by skills, by innovation, it's going to be quite challenging. Do we have the resilience and the confidence to navigate this? I'm 100% sure that we do. I think in the times that will come, institutions like this, which Arun supported, and people like you who are gathered here will have a very important role to play. And I'm 100% sure that many of you will be the change makers that we are looking for, both individually and collectively. Thank you for bearing with me. Thank you very much.